My husband disappeared on a Tuesday. I remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong. It was 6:47 p.m., and I was standing in the kitchen staring at my phone, watching the minutes tick by. Brandon was never late. In 12 years of marriage, he had never once been more than 10 minutes late without calling. The heavy, pressurized silence of the house, it began to scream. Have you ever looked at the person sleeping next to you and realized you didn't know them at all? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I need to know I'm not alone in this silence. Detective Richard stared at me through the haze of a precinct that smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade floor cleaner. He was a man out of time, his name plucked straight from a 1980s police procedural, and his eyes, well, they were even older. He didn't see a woman whose world had just evaporated into thin air. He saw a project, a case file, a suspect. He asked me for the timeline again, and I gave it to him with the clinical precision of a system diagnostic. 6:47 p.m. was the breach. 7:30 p.m. was the first series of failed pings. 8 o'clock p.m. was the widening of the search perimeter. My voice was steady, too steady for his liking. In my world, high-level cloud security isn't just a job, it's a mindset. I am the one people call when the architecture is under attack. I manage $1,500,000 in federal security grants because I don't crumble when the alarms go off. I analyze, I encrypt, and I stabilize. But Richard didn't care about my professional certifications. To him, my lack of hysterics wasn't a survival trait. It was a confession. He leaned across the scratched metal table, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, and told me I was cold-blooded. He said a real wife would be crying so hard she couldn't speak. I felt the invisible chains of the suspect tighten around my wrists, more restrictive than any metal shackles could ever be. This is the trap they set for the survivors, the ones who have learned to endure by staying quiet. My silence wasn't an absence of grief. It was the only thing holding my skin together. But in Richard's eyes, my stoicism was a deficit in my humanity. He was looking at a balance sheet of tears, and I was in the red. I realized that in this room, my vulnerability was a liability. Every tremor in my hands would be noted as a sign of weakness. Every deep breath would be recorded as a tactic to stay calm. I was caught in a cycle of learned helplessness, where the more I tried to prove my innocence through reason, the more guilty I appeared to his prehistoric intuition. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I looked at the clock on the wall and realized that every second we spent debating my heart rate was a second we weren't looking for Brandon. I didn't beg for his help. I simply informed him that if this conversation didn't pivot to a search warrant for Brandon's last known pings, my next call would be to my attorney, and this room would get very crowded very fast. I just stared back at him, my mind already pivoting from the emotional toll to a strategic assessment. This wasn't a search for the truth, it was a hostile takeover of my narrative. Richard was looking for a villain, and I was the only one in the room. I didn't answer his last three questions. Instead, I went back to the spreadsheet in my head, calculating the risk factors. My mother Elizabeth was at home with my 7-year-old daughter Olivia, and that was the only priority that moved the needle. The rest of the world could burn. Richard slammed his notebook shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped room, and walked out without a word. He left me in the dark, but inside, I was already glowing with a different kind of light, the kind made of facts, numbers, and the cold realization that the people who are supposed to protect you are often the ones building the cage. The social liquidation was faster than any server migration I'd ever managed. In the world of high-stakes cloud security, once your reputation is flagged, the entire network shuts you out. I became a zero-day vulnerability in the Chicago tech corridor. My professional peers didn't send flowers or thinking of you texts. They just revoked my access. My $1,500,000 federal security grant, the culmination of years of architecting robust, unbreakable defenses was frozen before the Tuesday headlines had even gone cold. It was a clinical de-provisioning. One day I was the lead architect with a key to the kingdom, and the next I was a system error. My compassion for my former colleagues had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and now the account was closed. I didn't waste energy calling the board members to plead for my position. I knew how the architecture worked. If the security certificate is untrusted, the connection is dropped. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a logic gate. The isolation wasn't just professional, it was personal, filtering down to the 7-year-old girl who shared my last name. Olivia came home from school with her head down, her dark curls hiding eyes that had seen too much for a second grader. The other parents didn't just ghost my calls, they pulled their children away on the sidewalk as if guilt were a contagious code. Olivia was being treated like a bug in a pristine system, an anomaly that needed to be patched out. She told me her best friend wouldn't sit next to her at lunch anymore because her mother said our house was dark. I didn't tell her it would be okay. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I just sat her on the counter and told her that sometimes the world reboots, and you have to be the one who decides which files to keep. The next morning, I notified the principal that Olivia would be finishing the semester via remote learning. If the school couldn't patch the social bugs in their hallways, I would move my daughter behind my own firewall. I stopped checking my personal emails. I stopped making morning coffee for 2. I began a total lockdown of our digital footprint, moving our assets into encrypted silos where the prying eyes of the neighborhood couldn't reach. My neighbor of 6 years started parking his car in the garage so he wouldn't have to witness the suspect across the street. I didn't wave. I didn't care. To me, he was just another peripheral device that had been disconnected. The wind off Lake Michigan carried a bite that mirrored the atmosphere in my living room. But while the world was busy judging me, I was busy fortifying. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I was cutting the dead weight, identifying the true nodes in my network. My mother, Elizabeth, was the only static IP in a sea of shifting addresses. Everyone else was just noise. And as a security engineer, I knew exactly how to filter the noise until only the signal remained. I was no longer Madison, the grieving wife. I was Madison, the cloud architect, and I was building a firewall that no one would ever breach again. The Justice for Brandon campaign didn't start with a search party. It started with a hashtag. Within 48 hours, my front lawn had been transformed into a staging ground for a high-stakes performance of suburban morality. The neighbors, people I had shared holiday cards and overpriced vintage wine with for 12 years, were now the lead actors in a predatory drama. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a villain to justify their own boredom, and I was the only suspect available for casting. Satellite vans lined the curb like scavengers waiting for a kill. Every time I cracked the blinds, a dozen long-range lenses adjusted their focus, searching for a stray tear or a sign of my resolve finally splintering. They were perpetually disappointed. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a public breakdown. Inside the house, I moved with the same methodical grace I used to patch a critical server breach. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress under active siege, and I was the commander of its defenses. The wind off Lake Michigan, known locally as the Hawk, tore through the neighborhood, carrying a chill that seemed to settle in the very marrow of my bones. It was a symbolic isolation, a physical manifestation of the coldness I felt from the world. Through the triple-paned glass, I watched my neighbor, Sarah, a woman who once borrowed my lawnmower and never returned it, holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Where is Brandon?" She wasn't looking for him. She was performing for the local news crews. To her, my husband's disappearance was a social currency she was eager to spend for 15 minutes of digital fame. My mother, Elizabeth, was the only node in my network that refused to fail. At 65 years old, she stood on the porch and stared down the circling reporters with a ferocity that made my heart ache. But even her loyalty was being weaponized against her. When she went to the grocery store, she was shadowed by cameras. People whispered murderer's mother as she reached for the milk. The social contagion was absolute. My former life was a subscription I had spent 12 years paying for, and now the service had been cut without notice because I was no longer a profitable image. I stood in the dimly lit hallway, looking at our wedding photo. The frame was cracked, a casualty of Detective Richard's heavy-handed search through our personal belongings, and the glass splintered across Brandon's smiling face. I didn't fix it. I didn't cry over the jagged edges of a shattered promise. I just noted it as another entry in the ledger of what this family had cost me. I realized that my compassion had been a luxury these people had overdrafted for years. Every sign on my lawn, every camera pointed at my 7-year-old daughter's bedroom window was an invoice for a debt I didn't owe. This wasn't a community, it was a market of outrage. And I was done being the silent investor in their version of family. As the Chicago wind howled against the brick, I went back to my laptop. The screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of raw facts, cold numbers, and the quiet retribution of a woman who had finally stopped playing a part she never signed up for. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. My husband had been missing for 22 days. The media scavengers had moved on to a fresher kill, leaving my front lawn a graveyard of flattened grass and discarded coffee cups. The predatory noise of the Justice for Brandon campaign had been replaced by a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight on the house. I was still a pariah, still blacklisted from the tech corridor, and surviving on the emergency reserves I'd moved into encrypted silos before the system could lock me out. But at 11:45 a.m., the grid changed. An unmarked black sedan pulled into my driveway. It didn't have the battered, desperate look of the news vans or the clumsy, aggressive stance of Detective Richard's squad car. This vehicle was silent, expensive, and possessed a lethal kind of authority. I watched through the blinds as the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. She was in her mid-40s, with hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful, and a dark suit that had been tailored with surgical precision. She didn't look like she was here to ask questions. She looked like she was here to deliver an ultimatum. I opened the door before she could knock. I didn't offer a greeting, and I didn't invite her in. I just performed a mental credential check, analyzing her posture and the way she scanned my perimeter. She didn't look like a local detective. She looked like a high-level executive from a firm that dealt in permanent solutions. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a badge. It wasn't the gold shield of the Chicago police. It was silver, embossed with an eagle, and bore the seal of the National Security Agency. "My name is Agent Tiffany," she said, her voice a flat, calibrated drone. "I am with the Special Operations Division. We need to talk, Madison." She didn't ask if I had time. She didn't wait for permission. She stepped across the threshold, forcing me to move back. The energy in the house shifted instantly from a local tragedy to a national security crisis. The air felt thinner, charged with a voltage I had only encountered in high-level defense briefings. She placed a small, matte black cylinder on the table, a portable frequency jammer, and signaled for my mother to take Olivia upstairs. We were officially off the grid. She sat at my kitchen table and slid a single sheet of paper across the wood. It was an official notice invoking the Espionage Act. I looked at the bold black lettering, and for the first time in 22 days, the suspect label felt like child's play. Richard had been playing with blocks. This woman was playing with the life of a sovereign citizen. She told me that from this second forward, my life was classified. Every word I spoke, every person I contacted, and every file I opened would be monitored under federal law. I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury for the civilians. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table, mimicking her own cold intensity. I told her that I had spent 12 years building unbreakable architectures for this government, and if she was here to talk about my security grants, she was wasting her time. Tiffany didn't flinch. She just looked at me with eyes that had seen the end of the world a dozen times and told me I was wrong. She said this wasn't about my code. This was about my husband. And then she told me the most terrifying thing of all. Brandon wasn't a victim, and he wasn't a runaway. He was an asset. Agent Tiffany didn't blink. She didn't offer a glass of water or a moment to process the weight of her words. She simply looked at me across my own kitchen table and dismantled my entire reality. "The man you knew as Brandon doesn't exist," she said, her voice as flat as a system error message. "His name is Elias. He was recruited by the National Security Agency at age 22. 3 years before he ever stepped into that coffee shop on 3rd Street to ask you about Roman architecture. The floor didn't just tilt, it evaporated. For 12 years, I had shared a bed, a bank account, and a child with a man who was essentially a high-end government simulation." Tiffany explained that our marriage wasn't a union, it was a constructed narrative. Brandon or Elias wasn't my partner. He was a shadow guardian. He was a special asset assigned to monitor the cloud security protocols and defense codes I was designing for the federal government. I was the objective. He was the containment strategy. I looked at the empty chair where he used to sit every morning for 4,380 days. I realized then that my marriage had been a subscription service, and the government had been footing the bill the entire time. I wasn't just a wife. I was a project under active surveillance. Every kiss had been a data point. Every anniversary had been a mission milestone. This is the trauma of emotional fraud. I realized there is a lethal difference between having a life and being in a life. Brandon was merely having a life. He had the house, the prestige, the wife, and the daughter, but they were just assets in his inventory. He was a professional actor in a 12-year play. I, however, was being in that life. My emotions were the only real variables in a world of constants. His identity was nothing more than a leased shell, a sophisticated skin he wore to get close to the source code. When his cover was blown 22 days ago, the shell didn't just break. It vanished because it lacked an internal truth to hold it together. He requested to be pulled out multiple times, Tiffany added, her tone softening by a fraction of a decibel. He claimed his feelings had become compromised. He said he couldn't maintain professional distance after Olivia was born, but the agency denied him. They told him he was too deep. They told him the cover was too perfect to abandon. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt a cold, clinical clarity settle over me. I wasn't mourning a husband anymore. I was mourning a ghost. I had been living in a curated reality designed by a committee, and the man I loved was just a line of code in a much larger operation. The indignation I felt toward the neighbors and the police suddenly seemed microscopic. They were just bullies. The NSA was the architect of my erasure. I looked at Agent Tiffany and realized that if Brandon was a ghost, then I was the only person left alive in this house, and I was done being a monitored asset. Agent Tiffany's voice dropped an octave, moving from clinical to conspiratorial. She didn't offer comfort, she delivered data. She told me that Brandon, the man I knew as a husband, but the agency knew as Elias, didn't just disappear because a foreign agent had flagged his identity. That was merely the cover story for the cover story. He vanished because he made a tactical choice to safeguard my newest encryption patent. She explained the risk profile in terms I understood. A rogue senator, using his position on the oversight committee, had been leveraging deep state data to facilitate a hostile industrial takeover of my proprietary security work. They wanted my code, the $1,500,000 federal grant result, to be their private, untraceable weapon. Brandon had detected the intrusion months ago. He didn't report it to his handlers at the National Security Agency because he knew the agency would likely permit the extraction in exchange for political favors. Instead, he went into the black site servers and executed a total data wipe. He deleted every trace of the senator's digital trail and the illegal requests. In doing so, he violated a dozen federal laws and effectively abandoned his post. He burned his career, his identity, and his physical presence in our lives to keep my architecture safe from being weaponized. He didn't just leave to protect us from spies. He left to protect my intellectual sovereignty from the very people he worked for. He had chosen the wife over the mission, a move that made him a ghost in the eyes of the government and a hero in the eyes of no one but me. He left a hardware contingency for you, Tiffany said, standing up to leave the Chicago house for the last time. Check the child's room. He knew you'd eventually look where the protection was strongest. I didn't wait for her unmarked sedan to pull out of the driveway. I walked to Olivia's room, the space that had become a bunker for my 7-year-old over the last 22 days. I knelt by the corner where Brandon used to sit in the rocking chair reading stories about ancient Rome while he secretly shielded our daughter from the shadows. I traced the grain of the floorboards until my fingers snagged on a plank that didn't sit flush. Underneath, nestled in the cold Chicago subfloor, was a small cedar box. Inside, protected by a vacuum-sealed anti-static bag, was a hardware security module, an HSM. To a civilian, it was just a piece of metal. To me, it was a digital fortress, a tamper-proof vault containing the only truth left in my world. I carried it to my office and plugged it into my air-gapped terminal. My fingers moved with the lethal speed of an architect under fire. The screen decrypted after a series of biometric checks Brandon knew only I could pass. A single log file appeared. No video of a weeping husband, just 3 lines of text. The mission was a construction, but the guardianship was real. I deleted the senator's files so you could own your future. Tell Olivia her father is a ghost, but he still watches the perimeter. Below the message lay the decrypted evidence of the senator's extortion, the ultimate insurance policy. It was the leverage I needed to force the agency to restore my clearance and erase the suspect tag forever. I stared at the glowing text. Outside, the neighbors were likely still refreshing their social media feeds, waiting for a scandal that would never come. They didn't know that the suspect in the house had just been vindicated by a ghost. The senator quietly resigned a month after my files hit the right desks, citing personal health reasons while his corrupt empire crumbled in the dark. Brandon hadn't just had a life with me. In his final act, he had been the shield. He had wiped the slate clean. I closed the terminal, the blue light reflecting off my wedding ring. My marriage had been a lie, but his sacrifice was the most factual thing I had ever encountered. 3 years have passed since that Tuesday in Chicago. I am 37 now, and the world looks very different from the top floor of my own security firm. I don't manage federal grants for others anymore. I build the architecture that protects families like mine, the ones the system tried to archive and delete. Elizabeth still keeps our home running with that same fierce loyalty, though she spends more time in her garden now, finally breathing air that isn't heavy with suspicion. The frozen grants, the tech corridor blacklists, the predatory neighbors screaming for a justice they didn't understand, those are all just broken lines of code in my past. I've learned that you don't need a committee's permission to exist, you just need the sovereignty to own your own truth. Olivia is 9 now. She is fast on the soccer field, her dark curls catching the light as she laughs with her teammates, completely unaware of the ghosts that still watch the perimeter. Last month, I was standing by the sidelines when I felt a familiar voltage in the air. I stopped walking and scanned the distant tree line bordering the park. About 100 yards away, partially obscured by the heavy spring shadows, stood a man in a nondescript baseball cap and sunglasses. Something deep within my instinct, the part of me that shared 12 years of morning coffee and constructed narratives, recognized him immediately. He turned his head just slightly, and for exactly 3 seconds our eyes met. He didn't run. He didn't reach out. He just smiled a small, sad, guardian's smile that whispered everything the Espionage Act had tried to silence. I'm okay. I'm watching. I still love you. He turned and vanished around the corner of the building before I could even take a step. I stood frozen, my eyes filling with tears as Olivia ran over to me, muddy and happy. I realized then that in a world of leased identities and national security myths, his love was the only factual thing I ever truly possessed. I've come to realize that we often spend our lives waiting for an apology that will never arrive, or a truth that is too dangerous to be spoken aloud. If you find yourself in a similar situation, sitting in your own version of that cold Chicago kitchen, remember that your worth isn't determined by who stays, but by the light you carry when everyone else disappears. To those of you who have been ghosted, judged, or made to feel like a suspect in your own life, I want you to know you aren't alone. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the silence they left behind. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that their narrative belongs to them and no one else. Drop a comment below and let me know your own story of surviving the silence. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story of resilience. Until next time, keep your firewall strong and your heart open.